welcome to today's episode of Daily Debrief, brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm your host Swastika, and let's get into our very first story. Staying with the developments from Ukraine and Russia war, reports from Moscow says roughly 1,000 members of the neo-Nazi Azov Battalion and the Ukrainian troops have already laid down their arms at Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol. The city has seen the heaviest fighting during the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, suffering immense destruction. Initially, the Western media had spun this as an evacuation of Azov Battalion, who were under the siege in Azovstal steelworks. Now let's get in Prabir to understand this a little better. Prabir, if you could tell us the immediate consequences of this surrender.
You see, the military consequences probably are marginal because this is about 1,000 troops. And they were not really tying down significant numbers of Russian troops either. Russian and Donbass regions, the regional forces over there who have aligned with the Russian army. So that's why I'm saying the military significance of people hold up underground tunnels, bunkers and so on in the steel plant may not have much strategic significance in that terms. But it has, of course, significance in a different way. Okay. This is the core place from which the Azov Battalion really sprung up. We also know that they have the wolf-sangel, which is basically a Nazi symbol. There's earlier history, but it's really been used widely as a Nazi symbol. And white supremacists have also used this symbol, including, in fact, the young man who shot up, killed 10 people in Buffalo. One of the symbols that he is on his page and everything is the same wolf-sangel because that's recognized worldwide as a mark of white supremacy symbols. Okay. So given that history, that Azov Battalion has never really shirked, though it might have claimed that it is not really Nazi, doesn't believe in these things. But the point is, if you dig a little deeper, it does come out. So the fact that Azov Battalion came from particularly Mariupol, it was centered there, it was instrumental in taking back the city in 2014 from the Donbass region's troops, the regional forces who fought the Ukrainian army. So this, therefore, is a symbolic significance to both sides. And the fact that it has now fallen after a long siege. And this siege, if you look at it, military was not important. Because after all, the troops that were holed up there were not blocking any large number of Russian troops. Neither did it have any military significance for the fact that they were holed up there. It's a large area and they were in underground bunkers. The steel plant was not functioning. So given that, it was of symbolic significance that the Azov Battalion has finally been destroyed militarily because the forces now there have surrendered. Now the question is, the Ukrainian government still says, though, there are soldiers, there are heroes, and we need to get them back. The question is that the Russians have always made this clear, that if they're Ukrainian soldiers, yes, they will be treated as prisoners of war. So in this sense, whoever has surrendered will be treated as prisoners of war. But if they have done atrocities, and the Azov Battalion has a history of that, known history, so they could be treated differently. Just like the Ukrainians claim they're going to put up some of the Russian soldiers on trial for basically violating various treaties, international obligations that soldiers have, and so on. So this kind of, if you start this kind of processes, of course it applies to both sides. So that we have to see, how is Russia going to treat the Azov Battalion's troops and the Ukrainian army, considering Azov Battalion was absorbed into the Ukrainian army. So they actually are now part of the Ukrainian armed forces. So I think this is a tricky issue at the moment. But the fact that this was something, this could have been done a month back, 20 days back, this is, I think, quite clear. And finally, they've run out of water, food, ammunition. I think this was on the cards all the time, that at some point they will do that, and at that point they will have to surrender. It's important to realize that there were a lot of wounded soldiers there, and the fact delaying this as long as they have done meant they could not actually look after the wounded soldiers, and some of them would have died as well. So I think that is unfortunate, but nevertheless, it's of great symbolic significance, but no major military significance that those who know military affairs better are saying.
Prabir, if we could talk about the long-term process that is of peace building, where is it? And also the war continuing. How do we look at these two?
I think the prospects of peace, immediate peace, has actually receded. If you remember, a couple of months back, there was talks going on between the Ukrainian government and the Russian government. Belarus was hosting some of those talks, and it had appeared that at some point it seems that they're very close to an agreement. But after that, things have gone actually completely in the reverse direction. And what we have found is ratcheting up the war hysteria, if we may say so, in countries who are not fighting the war, not in Ukraine, but in the United States, in the UK, parts of Europe as well. This war hysteria which has been created, objective of that has been very simple. Keep the pressure on Russia. Let's fight Russia to the last Ukrainian if need be. Let's give them arms and ammunition, but we will not fight. That's not something that we will do. But we will let the Ukrainians fight, pump them up, you're winning, victories around the corner, Russia's losing, the information war all over. And also the view that the economic war will tell on Russia and force them to back down. Now, economic war has failed. Clearly, the sanctions are not working. The oil prices have gone up, so have gas prices. Russia is making more money out of its exports of gas and oil after sanctions than they were doing before. And the European Union virtually finds that it cannot substitute for gas, oil, and even Russian coal in the short period. So they seem to have gained out of that. In fact, the Russian ruble today has a higher price against the dollar than it had before the sanctions were imposed. So they seem to have come out of the sanctions, the economic war, at least at the short term, and the predictions which were very dire for the Russian economy. Now those who had done those predictions are going back on it and say it doesn't look like Russia is going to be badly affected by this war. So what you have on the other side is really ratcheting up the military pressure by sending in more arms, more other ammunitions, talking about even heavy weapons being sent. All of this is not going to solve the problem of war. So if you are sending arms, you are actually partially entering the war. But you also have then a responsibility for peace, because you are in some sense participating in the war. We don't find any of the European countries, particularly those who are doing brutally, frankly, warmongering, like the United States, like UK. They're not in the war. They have no intention of being in the war. So in the interest of Ukraine, what does it mean? And here is the other problem. The Zelensky government at the moment is captive of NATO. Become a captive of NATO and the United States, because even for day-to-day military supplies, food supplies, money, it really needs the United States. So whatever little initiative it had, it seems to have given up. So we don't see any movement towards peace. And this is where the other parts of the world have to react. Asia, Africa, Latin America, that we need to have what used to be called the non-aligned movement come back and say, hey, you need to stop this war, because it's going to sink the economy of not only Ukraine, but a lot of other countries. And of course, Europe is going to be badly affected. They don't seem to see that. But also a lot of other countries who need, for instance, import food. So you are going to see enormous consequences. We already see it in India, inflation, food prices, etc. But enormous consequences in other parts of the world. But they don't seem to be reacting either. And I think that's a tragedy of what we see in Ukraine.
Well, thank you for those details, Prabhi. We'll come back to you as we do to understand the unfolding of this region. Thank you. On Tuesday, the United States announced the rollback of some energy sanctions on Venezuela. This is to encourage resumption of the dialogue and negotiation process between President Nicolas Maduro's administration and the far-right opposition parties. Now, senior officials of the US government told CNN that the reversal of sanctions would allow Chevron, the US energy company still operating in Venezuela, to negotiate the terms of its license with Venezuela's state-owned oil company PDVSA. This will permit operations to continue in the country. The announcements came one day after the Biden administration eased some sanctions on Cuba and marked the second reversal of Trump-era policies this week. The sanctions on Venezuela have intensified over the years and led to a massive humanitarian crisis. We talked to Zoe for more on this issue. Well, welcome to Daily Debrief, Zoe. I hope you're keeping well on your end.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Let's get into the first question right away, Zoe. Can you give us some more details about the rollback and what does that imply?
Yes, so yesterday there was an announcement made by the administration of Joe Biden that said that the government would roll back some of the energy sanctions that it's placed against Venezuela, and it would encourage the resumption of dialogue and negotiation process between the government of Nicolas Maduro and the far-right opposition parties. This has huge implications. Venezuela has been facing a series, a entire campaign of unilateral coercive measures against it in the energy sector. This has caused enormous setbacks in terms of its oil production. Venezuela lost a extremely large amount of its GDP because of the impact it's had on oil production in the country. It has historically been a large oil producer in the region. Much of its GDP is based on oil production. And so this has impacted the lives of ordinary Venezuelans. The government has not been able to fund the necessary social programs that it had been funding. It saw a massive social crisis. So this announcement by the Biden administration that was later confirmed by Venezuelan Vice President Delcy Rodriguez has been met with a lot of excitement and a lot of celebration because, as Rodriguez announced in her tweet, that this decision to lift some of the energy sanctions on Venezuela, the fact that the Venezuelan oil company PDVSA will start operating with Chevron, a US-based oil company, means that there is a path forward for lifting the illegal sanctions that have been affecting Venezuela. That started, of course, in 2014 when Barack Obama designated Venezuela a threat to national security, intensified greatly under President Donald Trump, and has caused, one of the worst economic crises in Venezuelan history.
Also, Zoe, could you tell us how this ties up in terms of the conversation between the Venezuelan government and the opposition?
Definitely. So in the midst of this economic crisis that really was provoked by these sanctions, by what Venezuelans call unilateral coercive measures, there was also a protracted political crisis. And the opposition in the country really took advantage of the strife that the people were facing to launch a series of different violent mobilizations, which are referred to as the guarimbas. This took place in 2014 and 2017. In 2019, of course, we see the designation, the unilateral designation of Juan Guaido as interim president of the country, and a series of other political charades by the far-right opposition to destabilize the government. And so throughout this whole period that there's been this kind of protracted political crisis, the government has actually attempted to engage in dialogue with the far-right opposition. Only recently, a year ago, was the actual very far right open to negotiating. Before, a lot of the dialogue processes were happening with less extreme sectors of the opposition, sectors that had not boycotted the elections. For example, the far-right opposition led by Juan Guaido has not participated in any electoral process since 2015. And so this dialogue process, this latest one, which has had sort of the most impressive gains, was started in Mexico City, but it was suspended after the illegal detention and extradition of Special Diplomatic Envoy Alex Saab from Cape Verde. He was on his way to Iran. He stopped over in Cape Verde for a refueling stop. He was detained there, held in prison, and then he was extradited recently to the United States. And so this really put a hold on the dialogue process that had been advancing with a lot of success, actually, in Mexico. But with this latest announcement from Joe Biden administration, he not only encouraged the resumption of the dialogue, but also members of the Venezuelan government have echoed this, and that they also hope to resume this dialogue process. Unsure if this will have an impact on the Alex Saab case, but for sure it will be positive. One of the key agreements that had been come to in this dialogue process was that all of the unilateral coercive measures against Venezuela must be lifted. The far-right opposition itself understands that this is not only against the Venezuelan government and whatever the political discourse that they wanted to put around sanctions, but first and foremost, these measures affect the people of Venezuela. They affect their well-being, their economic stability, their ability to live in the country. And so they're with this dialogue process resuming, with these rollback of the energy sanctions, it looks like some of the most damaging measures against Venezuela, the economic measures against them, could be lifted.
Also, interestingly, we just saw how some of the measures, some of the sanctions have been eased for Cuba. And now we see a small step that has been taken in the same direction for Venezuela as well. So, how do you see this playing out in terms of the larger geopolitical context?
Well, that's a great question, because none of this is happening in a vacuum. It's not by chance that the US government is turning to Venezuela for crude oil. It's not by chance that they're being kind of forced to backtrack on some of their most regressive and harsh rhetoric against these countries. On one hand, I think the Ukraine crisis, the severe energy instability of the United States. There was a headline today at Reuters that U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve has dropped to its lowest level since 1987. This is huge. Of course, one of the primary reasons that the U.S. is turning to Venezuela in this context is because it needs its oil. Venezuela has been a historic partner of the United States for getting crude oil. That is why they were so upset with the Bolivarian Revolution and Hugo Chavez's presidency, because it did threaten this strategic partnership that they had with the oil sector. Well, you talked about Cuba, and I think this is extremely important. Joe Biden is preparing for the Summit of the Americas to be held in Los Angeles in June. Many countries across the region have said that they will not attend this meeting because a member of the Biden administration had indicated that countries like Cuba, countries like Venezuela, Nicaragua would not be invited to the summit. And in response, there's been a cacophony of voices denouncing this move. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador of Mexico, Luis Arce of Bolivia, Xiomara Castro of Honduras, even Alberto Fernandez of Argentina, and some more center leaders. You see Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil also said that he wouldn't attend. And so this backlash against the U.S. foreign policy in the region, their policy of exclusion, has been met with disgust, and people have said no more sanctioning of Cuba, no more sanctioning of Venezuela, no more exclusion of these countries. And so the announcement by the Biden administration to also lift some of the Trump era restrictions against Cuba, it must be seen in this context. It's a huge advance for the relations. This had also been a campaign promise of Joe Biden to lift the Trump era sanctions. He hadn't done so in his first year and a half in office. Now he is finally doing this. This will cause also enormous relief for the Cuban people who have been suffering throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, throughout this intensification of the sanctions regime against them. So all of this has to be seen in the regional picture, the geopolitical picture, to really understand the motivations behind it.
Absolutely. Very interesting times, because the checkers of different countries are settling in very different way with the Ukraine-Russia war as well. Well, thank you for those inputs, Zoe. We'll keep coming back to you for more. That's all.
Thanks so much for having me.
More than 2 years into the pandemic, the US on Tuesday reached 1 million COVID-19 deaths, according to Johns Hopkins University data, and there are more than 82 million confirmed US cases on COVID-19 to date. the confirmed number of dead is roughly equal to how many Americans died in the Civil War and World War II combined. It is important to recall that according to WHO, there were another 1 million excess deaths during 2020 and 2021, which were likely due to COVID-19. Now, to get better understanding of these numbers, let's talk to Natalia Marquez of People's Dispatch.
Natalia, welcome to Daily Debrief. Let's get into the first question right away. So this is a big number that has, of course, emerged, and very tragic moment for US as a country. Now, could anything have been done in terms of the government action to prevent this death toll? And also, what would you say about the nature of the government's response to the COVID crisis as well?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, this death toll could have been prevented. I mean, obviously, it's a pandemic. There are going to be some unpreventable deaths, but 1 million is an enormous number. The United States is only 4.2% of the world's population, but it suffered over 16% of the deaths. And this has a lot to do with the initial response to the pandemic. When Donald Trump was president, the public health care in the United States was already very weak. And they were not, and nurses, doctors, healthcare workers were not given enough ventilators or personal protective equipment. A lot of the distribution of PPE fell on nonprofit groups rather than the government. There were images circulating of nurses wearing trash bags, at the height of the pandemic. New York City, where I live, experienced an enormous amount of deaths. People were being buried in mass graves here. It was an enormous tragedy that definitely could have been avoided. The governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, was really praised by the ruling class for his pandemic response. But at the same time, under Cuomo, the state had already lost 20,000 hospital beds in the state of New York. So already the public healthcare system going into the pandemic was very weakened. Nurses unions were protesting against the low staffing levels and the fact that nurses and patients were not protected well during the pandemic by the government. Again, not enough PPE, not enough ventilators, just a very gutted public healthcare system.
Also, could you talk to us about the racial and ethnic minorities and how the poor have been affected more by the pandemic? How do we read the kind of death toll that has taken place?
Yeah, so marginalized people, poor, working class, oppressed people are more likely to have jobs where they're working in person and can't work online. And so those frontline workers, subway workers, like train workers, train operators, nurses, food service workers, deliveries, are more likely to experience death because they're in contact people. Also, poor people are more likely to be evicted. There was an eviction moratorium at the beginning of the pandemic. There no longer is in the United States. Evictions are rising. And evictions are a public health crisis, right? Because if someone doesn't have a home, if someone's out on the street, it makes it more likely for them to contract COVID. And you see this in the numbers. Hispanic people represent a larger share of cases relative to their share of the total population, and this is the same for Black people. And so, class and race have an enormous effect on how many people are dying of this disease.
Well, definitely something that is a big number that has been put across a country that could have handled the pandemic a little differently, isn't it, Natalia?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you for joining us with those details. We'll come back to you for the stories. That's all.
Okay, thank you.
Well, that's all that we have for all of our viewers on Daily Debrief today. Do come back and tune into News Tomorrow with us. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And please don't forget to like and subscribe us on our YouTube channel.